All right, Alexander, let's talk about these documents, position papers that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has published. We have the Global Security Initiative concept paper, and then kind of underneath that, you have another paper with the title U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils. Makes for an interesting read. What's your take on these papers?
Well, they're an extraordinary read. I mean, the Chinese, the global security concept paper, I think we can, to some extent, disregard because it flows from the other. What the Chinese are doing is they're now accepting that they're in an adversarial relationship with the United States. I mean, this is now, it seems to me, a formal statement from China. These papers are a formal statement from China that there are now two poles in the world again. There's the American and there's the Chinese. The Chinese say the Americans conduct foreign policy this way. The Chinese say we conduct foreign policy in a different way. And that's what the concept paper is all about. The more interesting one and the easier one to read and the more, shall we say, colourful and vivid one is the one in which they discuss US hegemony. And I have to say it's astonishing. I mean, it is an absolute attack, a frontal assault on US foreign policy and the way it's conducted. Now, straight away, I have to say I agree with, most of us here on the Duran would agree with an awful lot of what's there. I mean, they say straight away that the United States disregards international law. It's very critical of this concept of the rules-based international order. It says that this is an attempt to demolish international law. It says that the US instigates wars. It interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. It doesn't accept that other countries have a right to develop in their own way. It tries to remodel their political systems. It engages in colour revolutions, and it gives a whole list of countries where there have been colour revolutions. It says that the United States is extremely warlike. It calls the United States the most warlike of all countries. It catalogues various US military interventions. It also talks about US economic abuse, if you like, the abuse the United States makes of its economic position, its manipulation of the dollar system to its own advantage. It talks about the US looting most of the world, for its own benefit. It talks about how the United States tries to prevent other countries' technological development. It gives an example of Japan in the 1980s. It says that the United States is trying to do the same thing to China as well. And in some ways, for me, the most interesting section, I say interesting because it's new coming from the Chinese, is that there's a whole section about how the United States is trying to spread its own value system through culture, through media, through social media, through films, and the way that this is immensely disruptive of values and traditions in other countries, and it's ultimately corrupting to those systems. So it's an extraordinary paper, actually. But let's take a step back, because we've heard all of this from someone else, and the person we've heard it from is Vladimir Putin. I mean, if you think about this, this is very, very similar to the critique that Vladimir Putin, I wouldn't say similar, I'd say it's identical to the critique that Vladimir Putin has been making of US policy now for several years. He even attended, if you remember, a Davos, a session at Davos about 2 years ago. And in front of people like Klaus Schwab, he made all these kind of attacks. He's talked about unipolarity, the US quest for hegemony. He's been doing that ever since the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where he delivered that famous speech with Senator McCain is fuming in the front row. So what we now see is that the Chinese have wholesale accepted the Russian critique of US foreign policy, of the globalist foreign policy as well, because that also plays a part of that, but they particularly focus it on the United States. So what we now have, and it's very straightforward, is a complete conceptual, even ideological convergence between the Chinese and the Russians about foreign policy. The Chinese are now saying we're against American exceptionalism, against what the neocons are doing, and though the Chinese still sometimes pretend that they are supporters of globalization, it's difficult to read this position paper and not feel that they've accepted again the Russian view that globalization is a bad thing. The kind of globalization that Klaus Schwab and some people in the West have been promoting from a Chinese point of view and a Russian point of view, is now a bad thing. So we now have the Chinese converging with the Russians as they decide that, from their point of view, the United States is an adversary. It's almost, if you like, the enemy, and they're part now of this partnership with the Russians, pushing back against all of these things.
Okay, so the Chinese, obviously, they understand that if things go badly for Russia with this conflict in Ukraine, and Russia's eventually, let's say, balkanized by Newland and Sullivan, Blinken, Biden, the plan to get regime change in Russia and balkanize Russia with the defeat in Ukraine. The Chinese understand that they're next. So that's one way to explain this paper. But another way to look at this paper is to look at the Chinese as saying, Russia is winning, and the 80% of the global South has not moved away from Russia's position in this conflict with the collective West. And so the time is right for us now, as China, as the big partner in this new system that's being set up. Now is the time for us to assert ourselves and say, here we are. We're here. This is our position. This is what we offer the world. Who wants to try out this new way of doing things? I guess the question to you is, China would not be coming out with this paper if they didn't understand that things are going very well, not only for Russia, but in the war, not only for Russia in the war, but also in terms of the sanctions, of the economic war, of moving away from the U.S. dollar, in energy. I mean, I think they feel comfortable with the situation, yes, so that they can now come out and say, here we are, and we're the leader of this new system, or we're going to take the lead in this new system.
Exactly. And this is exactly what it is. Now, can I just say, first of all, let's talk about the first point, about Ukraine. Let's specifically talk about Ukraine, which is not really, this is a much bigger thing than just Ukraine. But Wang Yi, who is now in overall charge of Chinese foreign policy, is in Moscow. He's had a whole succession of meetings. He's met Patrushev, who's the head of the Security Council, very powerful man, Putin's national security advisor, the man who's also in overall charge of the Russian intelligence community. He had a very, very big session with Lavrov, and he's also met Putin himself. And we know that part of the purpose of his visit to Moscow is to prepare the ground for Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, which is now expected at some point next month. So Xi Jinping is heading to Moscow. Now, over the course of all of these meetings, there was a discussion between Lavrov and Wang Yi. And we've only got one readout so far. It's very sketchy, and it comes from the Russian Foreign Ministry. But it said that the Chinese and the Russians agree about what was the root cause of the Ukrainian conflict. So that means, if we follow it through, that the Chinese also agree with the Russians about what caused the Ukrainian conflict, because the Russians have set it out in enormous amounts of detail. Now, given that that is so, and given that, as you absolutely rightly say, the Chinese understand that this is a neocon project, and that the neocons, if they manage to succeed in Ukraine, would move on to come after China once they've broken up, fragmented, pulped Russia, imposed their own kind of system on Russia. The Chinese are not going to let that happen. And I think this is the thing people now need to understand. If the US goes on escalating in Ukraine, the Chinese, for the moment, want to keep their distance. They don't want to be seen visibly sending arms to Ukraine. But if they go on escalating to the point where it really looks as if the Russians might get into trouble, the Chinese will step in. And they will not allow Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, because it has now become a matter of vital strategic interest to the Chinese that the Russians don't lose. Now, that's an important point to understand, but it's come out clearly both from Wang Yi's visit and from what is contained in all of these position papers. So that's the first thing to say. But the second thing, and it's the second point that you were making, is actually the more important one. Because why have the Chinese come out with all these things now? They've come out with all of these things now for exactly the reason that you say. They feel they can, because the drift of world opinion is in their favour. It's moving towards these positions, which Putin very courageously outlined years ago, but they're obviously now gaining increasing traction around the world. We're seeing this currently at the current UN General Assembly session, where it seems the West is having great trouble putting together a resolution, a General Assembly resolution, critical of Russia over Ukraine. What we're hearing is that it's been basically stripped of all substance. But even that is apparently having problems getting traction there. So the Chinese see that. They see that global opinion is turning against the US, that the Saudis are drifting away from the US, that the Brazilians refuse to get involved in the war in Ukraine, that Mexico is speaking out, that the African leaders are siding with the Russians, that everybody seems to be increasingly exasperated with the neocons and with the Americans and with the EU, which is, of course, the neocons' willing accomplice. And the Chinese are saying, this is our moment. We are far and away the most powerful country that is rivaling the US. This is our moment. This is the moment when we can come out, say to the world straightforwardly, this is what America, the neocons in America, how they conduct foreign policy. And we are your champion. We will stand with you all around the world as you resist it. And we've come up with our alternative foreign policy, our alternative vision of the world, which is all, of course, about cooperation and friendship and respecting international law and respecting the rights of countries to choose their own destinies, and is opposed to interference in internal affairs and all of those things. So you see that the Chinese sense that this is their moment and they're seizing it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the real war. I mean, what's
Yeah.
happening in Ukraine is, to me, is a battle in this larger war, which is the movement from a unipolar neoliberal globalist world order to something else, or at least having the option to have something else. Doesn't mean the one goes away, but at least now you're going to have a different system that that other countries, specifically countries in the global south, maybe even NATO members like Turkey, maybe even EU members like Hungary, they can look at this alternative system and they can say this is interesting. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll look further into the way they're doing things and look into their organizations and the way they provide financing, or the way they can help out on an economic level or on a trade level or even on a military level. So I mean, it does provide a new alternate system for a lot of the countries in the world that up until today were stuck with just one player, and that was this neoliberal globalist thing. And so that brings me to what I consider to be one of the biggest lies of the conflict in Ukraine, which is that Russia is isolated. And I think that China now has kind of blown apart that lie. And I think this explains a lot of the panicked moves that we've seen from the collective West over the last couple of weeks. It explains these red line warnings to China. I think it explains the Biden trip to Kiev and the weird speech that he gave in Poland. Because I'm seeing the collective West, they're very afraid of people waking up, especially in Europe or the United States, and just kind of saying, is Russia really that isolated? Because it seems like China is with them. And not only is China with them, it seems like this whole new system is being built. Maybe we're the ones that are isolated. Maybe it's our leaders that have isolated us. Maybe they're the ones that are taking us down the wrong path, or down a more isolated path. I just feel like these statements, this paper out of China is blowing apart this whole, Russia's isolated. There are no other options left for Russia. The whole world is with us, and this is the reality that we want all of our people to understand. And now China's coming out and they're saying, no, we're actually 100% with Russia, and with us comes everybody else. Like, we're going to take everybody along with us.
Right. Let's deal with both points. The first point that you made about some countries, even within the Western system, being attracted to this. Absolutely. You mentioned Hungary, definitely. I mean, notice that Orban didn't go and meet Biden. I mean, he actually stayed away. I mean, he chose to stay away. I mean, Turkey. I mean, whatever happens in Turkey, 70% of people in Turkey now apparently regard Russia as a friend. So I don't think that's going to change. So Turkey, also many countries, other countries in the Balkans as well. You can see that it's going to be attractive to more and more places. I mean, in Italy, I mean, all sorts of places in Europe, you could see that this might be attractive too. And you are absolutely right. This is the single thing that has spooked the West, perhaps most of all. Three things have happened over the course of this conflict. Firstly, there's been the military side. We've discussed this exhaustively. It's not going well, but in some ways that's the least important. The second was the sanctions, this weapon that the West has deployed in so many places, and which has leveled whole economies and destroyed entire countries. And Russia has withstood the sanctions, and that spooked them. Because, of course, if they lose, that their sanctions weapon loses effectiveness, then their most powerful coercive weapon in international relations has gone. But third, and this is the thing that scares them most, it's now clear that global opinion is moving away. the expectation was, the assumption was, right at the start of this conflict, that they'd be able to paint the Russians as the aggressors in Ukraine. Russia has launched this invasion of Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor. Russia has broken international law. You know, they always discover international law when it suits them, so they talk about international law. And they assumed that they'd be able to rally the world around Russia, isolate Russia, break it economically, defeat it militarily. And of course, what's happened is the opposite. Not only is Russia not isolated, not only is most of the world openly sympathetic to the Russians, as it sees that the Russians are facing not really Ukraine at all, but the collective West behind it. But it's acting as a catalyst. It's making more and more countries around the world openly critical and rebellious against the globalist system. And that has spooked them. I mean, you only have to look at some of what, the newspapers, the media articles that are appearing in some Western newspapers now, to see how unsettled they are by this. The fact that, as I said, instead of them isolating Russia, they've become isolated instead. That they have these meetings with leaders and officials from the global south, and instead of being, listened to with awe and agreement, what they find instead is that the global south just shakes its head, tells them you're absolutely wrong, or you've gone mad, or you've taken leave of your senses, and that we're with the Russians on this. And this has really, really spooked the West. It was not what they expected. Remember, when Biden came in, he was talking about this League of Democracies that he was going to create against the League of Autocracies. He even held a big summit about that. He invited all sorts of countries, including countries like Angola, for example, which is not perhaps meets some people's definition of a democracy. And they all turned up and they all listened. There was clearly an attempt to create dividing lines and to isolate the Chinese and the Russians. And it's turning out otherwise. And as I said, this is not what they expected. This is not how they thought it would turn out. But it's what's happening. And at the moment, they don't know what to do and how to respond. Can I just finish with one particular thing? I mean, if you remember, you go back in history, during the Second World War, the United States and Britain, Churchill and Roosevelt came up with the Atlantic Charter, which was their manifesto of what the world ought to be like once the other side, the Axis powers, had been defeated. And the Atlantic Charter eventually led to this foundation of the United Nations and to all sorts of other things that followed. Well, a couple of months ago, about a year ago, shortly after Biden was elected, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden came up with their revised Atlantic Charter. And that notice has vanished without trace. Nobody is interested. Nobody around the world cares. Even the media now in the US and Britain don't refer to this preposterous document. What we're now getting from the Chinese and the Russians, but the Chinese obviously now taking the lead, is, if you like, their counter. But it is in tune with the spirit of the times, which what Biden and Johnson were putting together was not. So this is going to gain traction. And what the Biden-Johnson Atlantic Charter thing, as I said, that's vanishing without trace. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is a sign of how much on the defensive the globalists, the neocons, all that assortment of frightful people now found themselves to be.
Well, that's because they don't have any plan. They don't have any solutions to anything. They don't provide any type of alternative viewpoints of things. I mean, you listen to a Biden speech, and I think he said the name Putin something like 10 or 12 times. They're completely fixated on Russia, Putin, and this defeat in Ukraine, completely obsessed with it. And even this obsession doesn't have a real plan. There's nothing.
No.
There's nothing really to analyze or to discuss or to really grab hold of. It's just these canned lines that they put together in a speech, and they just talk about how Putin's bad, Putin's evil, Putin's an autocrat, Ukraine's going to win, Ukraine's going to be victorious, and freedom, democracy for all. I mean, that's their speech. This is an unprovoked war, and we're going to defend Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Yes.
Okay, they've been saying this now for 6 months, and
yes,
and there's nothing there. There's nothing to grab hold of, and that's it. And I think the whole world is realizing this. The whole world's kind of like, and I mean, they're listening to Biden. They're saying, and then they listen to a Putin speech or Wang Yi speak, and they're like, okay, I may not agree with the ideas, but they're ideas. I may not agree with the vision, but it's a vision. Interesting plan that he has there. I mean, there's something to go off of.
Absolutely. I mean, what the West is doing, what the Biden administration, let's just talk about the Biden administration, they're coming across as angry and obsessed and ultimately destructive. And this is, by the way, what the Chinese have honed in on. They say, look at US foreign policy today. It is destructive. We are constructive. We are providing you with a plan for you, a plan that might work for you. You might be completely cynical about this. I think most people around the world, are not fools. I mean, they can see this. They understand that the Chinese are promoting their own self-interest. But nonetheless, they see a country, a power, a great power, and they see that with the Russians too, which is coming across as full of ideas, full of proposals for the way forward, constructive ideas. They don't talk in hysterical language. They're full of facts. They have facts at their fingertips. Putin's speech pours out facts, statistics, ideas, proposals, suggestions, plans. And as I said, what they get from the United States, I have to say this, it sounds like the fixations of a very angry old man in a hurry, by the way. And the Europeans, just as bad.
The Europeans are empty. I mean, they look worse because they're following this. Yeah. They're following this this crazy guy who's angry all the time, and what the world sees, what the 80% of the world sees, the global South, is they see emotional hysteria and panic.
Yes,
and no one likes that. No one wants to follow someone who's emotional and angry and panicked all the time. And I think they're just sick of the whole Putin this, Putin that, Putin this, Putin. I mean, everyone's gotten tired of it.
Yes.
But the neocons that are running the show, they haven't gotten the memo. I mean, they're still driving home at this, and they send Biden to Poland to give the same old tired speech.
Yes. Yeah, but they can't let it go. I mean, I have to say, I find it very difficult to understand what the purpose of that trip was, actually. Both the one to Ukraine and the one to Poland. I mean, he didn't say anything, really, whilst he was there, except, as you said, all the old cliches and angry words that, we've heard so many times before. There's even a cartoon, by the way, about this in the London Times, in which, you have JFK, about in Berlin, Reagan, bring Mr. Gorbachev, bring down this wall, and you see, Biden just looking angry and vacant and not really saying anything very much. So that's even in the London Times, they've noticed this. So, and that is exactly what the world sees. And people are tired with this obsession and this, frankly, irrational hatred of this one individual, Putin, and his country. And the problem is that the neocons, like obsessive people always, won't let it go. Because obsessive people never give up on their obsessions. They can't. They can't give up on their obsessions. They can't give up on their plans. Because if they did, they wouldn't be neocons anymore.
Yeah. So this is the moment in history, this past couple of days, where China has become the leader of this new system. I mean, this is historic, and I think it's a system that the U.S. and Europe can't compete against. I mean, they'll compete to a certain extent, but they can't win a China-Russia alliance. They'll never call it an alliance, Russia or China. They'll never call it that, but that's what it is. And then if you throw in the other BRICS nations, you throw in India and Brazil and South Africa, and you have Iran coming in, and Saudi Arabia, and possibly Turkey, and possibly Argentina. You have all these countries now coming into this system. This is catastrophic for the United States, and it was accelerated by the Joe Biden White House. I mean, they did this to themselves. And the worst part about it is that the United States has to go up against this system that China and Russia are leading, specifically China's leading, while they have to take care of Europe. Europe isn't a partner that's going to add to the competition. They're going to drag the U.S. down because Europe has nothing to offer the U.S. China has something to offer Russia. Russia has something to offer China, even though China is much more powerful on multiple levels, maybe not militarily, but on all the other levels, all the other metrics. It's the larger partner in this relationship, but they both have something to offer each other as they go up against the globalist neoliberal order. But the United States and the EU is, I mean, American citizens have now been saddled with this deindustrialized European Union, which is going to offer nothing to the United States. It's just going to be dragging the U.S. down.
I completely agree with that. I mean, this is the thing I've said before, that there is this view that strengthen the U.S. economy at the expense of Germany's, get all the Germans to relocate their factories in the U.S. I mean, I have never really gone along with this. I mean, in its great days during the Cold War, the United States worked to strengthen its allies. It supported Europe economically, so that Europe could take off economically. I mean, whereas it supported it, I mean, I didn't mean it just subsidised it. It understood that a strong Europe was in its interests, because that gave its alliance system critical mass. Now, when the United States is, relatively speaking, in a weaker position than it was in its heyday in the 1940s and 1950s and early 1960s, when, it accounts for a much smaller share of the world economy than it did then. Instead of letting its partners, its allies in Europe also become strong, it's become destructive towards them. So that instead of these allies adding value to the alliance with the United States, they're going to become a burden on the United States. But again, that is what the neocons do. The neocons are never constructive. They are always destructive. They're destructive towards the US's alliance systems. They're destructive towards US outreach towards other countries, third countries. They've destroyed any possibility of, the US developing a good, stable relationship with Russia, which might have kept it distanced from China. They're doing the same now with China. China now is prioritizing its relationship with Russia. Because, as you absolutely rightly say, they have no plan. The only plans they have are destructive ones, and they're working against the United States.
Yeah. All right. Any other final thoughts, or should we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I think this is a pivotal moment. I mean, this isn't something that people have, fully grasped, but it was already remarkable how Wang Yi dominated the Munich Security Conference basically by just being there. People weren't interested in what Kamala Harris had to say. Everybody wanted to know what Wang Yi had to say. Everybody was lining up to speak to him, and at the same time, utterly spooked by whatever he said. And, he said very little. And when he did speak, he spoke in very, very polite ways. But nonetheless, they were scared. They're nervous. They've never been more nervous. And it is a pivotal moment. It's one that's crystallizing the change that's happening. And it is accelerating. And you're absolutely right. You want to see why. You want to understand why. You're an American and you want to understand why it's happening so fast. Look no further than at the White House, the person who is there in the Oval Office and the team around him. This terrible gaggle of ideologues and neocons who have captured control of the foreign policy of America.
Yeah. All right. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rockfin as well. And go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.